morning had started like any other in downtown Atlanta. Bright glass towers reflecting the sun, a rhythm of honking horns and pressed suits, the steady hum of a city chasing deadlines. Inside one of those towers stood the flagship branch of Crescent National Bank, the kind of place that prided itself on mahogany counters, perfectly tailored smiles, and a reputation for serving distinguished clients. But that morning, something unusual was about to happen inside those marble walls, something the staff would remember for the rest of their careers. When Denise Parker walked through the revolving doors, she wasn't wearing power the way she usually did. No television crew, no assistant trailing behind her, no bodyguards or chauffeur waiting outside, just a woman in a navy coat carrying a leather tote, and a calmness that seemed out of place in the rush-hour chaos. The receptionist looked up briefly, then returned to typing. No one recognized her, at least. Not yet. Denise made her way to the teller line, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The air smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. She'd come for something simple, a cash withdrawal, something she hadn't done personally in years. Her personal assistant usually handled banking, but this time she wanted to do it herself. Something about touching the process, feeling the transaction, reminded her of where she started, of long nights balancing numbers when every dollar meant survival. At the counter, Laura Keene, the teller, greeted her with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning. How can I help you today?" "I'd like to withdraw $50,000, Denise said evenly, sliding her identification across the counter. Laura blinked. "I'm sorry, ma'am, 50,000? "Yes," Denise replied, her tone steady but polite. "From my business account." Laura's expression faltered. She glanced down at the screen, then back up. "Do you have an appointment with the manager?" "I wasn't aware I needed one to access my own funds," Denise replied, her voice soft, controlled but with a weight that made Laura shift uncomfortably. "Just one moment," Laura murmured, and disappeared toward the office behind the glass walls. Denise waited. She didn't check her phone, didn't sigh or look impatient. She just watched the marble floors, the gold-framed certificates, the portrait of the bank's founder gazing down with the smug calm of inherited wealth. She'd met him once years ago, when Crescent National was just another mid-sized institution long before her company's mergers had helped triple their client base. The irony wasn't lost on her. Moments later, Greg Whitman, the branch manager, stepped out of his office. Early 40s, slick hair, immaculate tie, the kind of man who believed his authority was best displayed in how long he could keep others waiting. He smiled, the rehearsed kind that always stopped short of sincerity. "Good morning," he said, extending a hand. "Greg Whitman, branch manager. My teller tells me you're requesting a large withdrawal." "I am," Denise said, shaking his hand. $50,000 from my business account, Parker Innovations Holdings." Something flickered across Greg's face. Recognition, maybe. Or suspicion. "Parker Innovations," he repeated. "That's quite a significant account." "Yes," Denise said calmly. "It should make this process fairly simple." Greg's smile tightened. "Normally, withdrawals of that size require prior notice, especially when it's from a corporate account." Denise tilted her head slightly. "It's a checking account, not an investment fund, and I have the authority." "I understand," Greg said, his voice lowering slightly as he motioned her toward his office. "But I'm afraid I can't approve it without verification." Denise followed him inside. The office smelled faintly of cologne and leather. Awards for regional excellence lined the shelves, proof of ambition without context. Greg motioned toward the chair across from his desk. "Please, have a seat," Denise did, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "Mr. Whitman, may I ask what verification do you need that the teller hasn't already provided?" "Well," Greg began, opening her account profile on his computer. "You understand, of course, that large cash transactions require special handling. Anti-fraud measures. Compliance regulations." "Of course," Denise replied evenly. "I helped write those policies." Greg paused. "Excuse me? I'm on Crescent National's executive client board," Denise said, her tone still mild. "Or I was last quarter. My company manages several accounts here, including the commercial loan restructuring program your regional division implemented last spring." Greg blinked. "I wasn't aware." "That much is clear," Denise said softly. A brief silence followed. Outside the glass walls, the movement of tellers and clients went on, oblivious. Greg cleared his throat. "Still, I'm afraid I'll need additional verification from headquarters." Denise studied him. the way his confidence leaned on procedure, not understanding. "Is that your policy?" she asked finally, "or your hesitation?" Greg's jaw tightened. "It's procedure, Ms. Parker." "That's what I thought," she said quietly, standing. "Then follow it carefully, because this conversation is now on record." Greg frowned. "I beg your pardon?" Denise gestured toward her tote bag, where a small digital recorder light blinked faintly. "For transparency, of course. It's standard practice when my company audits banking relationships." Greg's throat bobbed. "Audit? You work with the auditors?" "I am the auditor," she said simply, her eyes meeting his. "And you just refused a transaction that violates your own client charter." Outside the office, Laura watched nervously from her counter. Tom Reeves, the security guard, shifted near the entrance, glancing between the office and the line of customers, pretending not to stare. The air felt heavier now, like everyone knew something had shifted, though they couldn't quite name it. Greg cleared his throat again, trying to reclaim authority. "Ms. Parker, please understand." "I do," Denise interrupted gently. "I understand perfectly. And I suggest you call your regional director. Tell them Denise Parker is here and would like to discuss Crescent National service standards." Greg hesitated. "You expect me to call," she said. Not loudly, just firmly enough that the weight of the word seemed to fill the room. He reached for the phone. 5 minutes later, Greg was no longer smiling. His face had turned the color of wet concrete. The voice on the other end of the line had gone from confusion to panic, then to apology. He hung up slowly and looked at Denise, who hadn't moved from her seat. "They, confirmed your identity," he said. "Good," Denise replied. "Now about my withdrawal." Greg swallowed hard. "Of course, Ms. Parker. I'll have the funds arranged immediately, though it may take some time for the teller to count." "Have it delivered," she said. "To my office," he blinked. "Delivered?" She nodded. "In a sealed courier bag with dual signatures. That's standard, isn't it?" Greg's mouth opened, then closed again. "Yes, of course," Denise stood, smoothing her sleeve. "You see, Mr. Whitman, the issue was never the money. It was how you assumed I didn't belong to it." Greg said nothing. She turned to leave. At the door, she paused and looked back. "You might want to review your staff training modules, especially the ones on client engagement and implicit bias. I'll be sending recommendations." Then she walked out calm, composed, unhurried. The kind of exit that didn't need noise to command attention. Laura avoided her eyes as she passed. Tom, the security guard, nodded faintly, unsure what he was acknowledging. The lobby had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes when everyone knows they just witnessed something they shouldn't have. Outside, Denise inhaled deeply. The city felt different now, sharper somehow. She hadn't meant to make a scene. She'd come for something simple, and instead uncovered something ugly. But she knew better than most that power revealed people faster than pressure did. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number. "Renee," she said, "set up a meeting with Darius and Harold. Crescent National just failed a basic decency test." Her assistant's voice came crisp and alert. "On it, Miss Parker, what happened?" Denise glanced back at the bank's glass doors. They forgot who they were dealing with. That evening, in the penthouse office of Parker Innovations, the city lights stretched across the skyline like a circuit board. Denise stood by the window, her reflection framed against the night. Behind her, Renee Carter and Darius Holden sat across the conference table, folders open, expressions grim. "So they denied the withdrawal?" Darius asked, disbelief in his tone. "Initially," Denise said, turning back to face them, "their manager decided to verify my identity." Renee frowned. "Even after you told him who you were?" "Especially after," Denise replied. "He didn't believe I could own that kind of account." Darius shook his head. "Classic profiling. And at your own bank, too. Ironic, isn't it?" Denise said, sitting down. "Crescent National owes half its liquidity growth to our projects. I practically built their expansion framework. So what's the play?" Renee asked, her pen poised above her notebook. Denise opened a folder and slid it across the table. Inside was a stack of documents, compliance audits, transaction reports, client complaint summaries. "This," she said, "is what happens when arrogance meets accountability. We're launching a full-scale client relations review unannounced." Darius arched a brow. "You're auditing them?" "I'm exposing them," Denise corrected. "But politely," Renee smirked. "Politely?" Denise leaned back. "Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it signs a contract." Years before she was the CEO of a tech conglomerate, Denise Parker had stood in a bank just like that one, only poorer, smaller, and far less kind. She'd been 23, newly graduated, trying to cash her first paycheck from a startup internship. The teller had looked at her the same way Laura did earlier that day, like the money didn't quite fit the person holding it. She remembered walking out with tears in her eyes and a promise on her tongue. One day you'll work for me. It wasn't anger that drove her, it was precision. Denise didn't climb. She calculated. She studied finance, technology, and systems not to chase wealth, but to understand control. She'd seen how institutions treated people like her. Women who didn't come from legacy, who didn't inherit their seat at the table. And she vowed never to depend on anyone's permission again. That's why Crescent National's refusal wasn't just an insult. It was a symptom of everything she'd spent her life dismantling. By the next morning, emails were already flying. Crescent National's corporate office had received formal notice. Parker Innovations Holdings would be conducting a surprise compliance audit on all regional branches. Greg Whitman's name was at the top of the review list. When he arrived at work, his assistant was pale. "Sir, there's a delegation waiting in the boardroom." From Parker Innovations, Greg's stomach dropped. "What? 3 people? A woman named Renee Carter says they're here to evaluate branch operations." Greg straightened his tie and walked toward the boardroom. Inside, Renee sat flanked by 2 auditors. Her smile was polite, but her tone was pure steel. "Good morning, Mr. Whitman," she said. "We're here to review client service protocols. Ms. Parker sends her regards." Greg froze. "This is today?" "Effective immediately," Renee said. "I suggest you clear your schedule." By mid-morning, the air inside Crescent National Bank felt heavier than usual. Conversations that normally floated across the lobby in polite tones now came out clipped, cautious, as if everyone could feel that something had shifted. Greg Whitman, the branch manager who had started his day with quiet arrogance, now found himself sweating through his dress shirt. He hadn't slept much. The call from regional headquarters last night had been brief and unnerving. They wanted a full account of yesterday's client interaction, which, in the polished language of upper management, meant they were already investigating him. He kept replaying it in his head. The way Denise Parker had spoken with such composure, the faint glint in her eyes when she'd told him the conversation was being recorded. It hadn't felt like a threat then. Now it did. He stood in the boardroom facing 3 people who represented Parker Innovations, the company his branch depended on, for nearly 30% of its corporate deposits. The woman leading the delegation, Renee Carter, had the same calm authority Denise had. Her blazer was immaculate, her tone firm but polite. Behind her sat 2 auditors who had already begun sifting through transaction records. Greg tried to regain footing. "I'm just surprised this review came so suddenly," he said. "Normally, corporate evaluations are scheduled in advance." Renee smiled slightly. "That's true for regular audits. This isn't one of them," Greg swallowed. "Then what exactly is it?" "An internal review," she said, glancing at a tablet. "Ms. Parker requested it personally. She's asked us to examine Crescent National's client service protocols, staff compliance, and—" She paused, her gaze meeting his. "Leadership culture." The words landed like a quiet verdict. Greg tried to mask his panic behind professionalism. "Well, of course, we're happy to cooperate." Renee nodded. "Good. Then you'll have no problem providing your employee evaluations and training logs for the past 12 months. He forced a smile. "Naturally." Outside the boardroom, Laura Keene stood near her desk, pretending to sort receipts but listening closely. She'd spent the night thinking about what had happened with Denise Parker. She'd replayed every word, every uneasy glance. She hadn't meant to offend anyone, she'd only followed Greg's orders. But now she realized she'd been complicit in something bigger than a misunderstanding. When she overheard one of the auditors mention implicit bias, her stomach tightened. Across town, Denise sat in her office at Parker Innovations, reading the preliminary reports Renee had sent over. Her company's headquarters occupied the top floors of a glass tower that bore her name. The skyline stretched before her like an empire built on quiet precision not inherited, but earned. Her assistant entered softly. "Miss Parker, your mentor's here." Denise looked up. "Send him in." Harold Gaines entered with the ease of someone who didn't need introductions. A retired banker in his 60s, Harold had the kind of presence that made rooms still themselves when he spoke. "You're making waves again," he said, settling into the chair across from her. I saw the memo. Denise smiled faintly. I warned them years ago about customer relations training. They didn't listen. They rarely do until it costs them, Harold replied. So what's your endgame here? I don't want revenge, Denise said. I want reform. But I also want accountability. Greg Whitman didn't just question my transaction. He questioned my right to exist in that space. That's not procedure. That's bias disguised as policy, Harold nodded. And you're using their own system to fix it. Classic Denise. She looked out the window, her reflection merging with the city lights. When I was starting out, I promised myself I'd never let another person feel small because of someone else's assumptions. Not while I had power to stop it. Just make sure it doesn't become personal, Harold warned gently. People like Greg destroy themselves faster than anyone can push them. Denise's expression softened. Oh, it's not personal. It's structural. But sometimes structure needs a demonstration. Back at the bank, Renee and her team moved like a quiet storm. They interviewed staff, reviewed emails, and pulled client service records. It didn't take long to see a pattern. Complaints about unresponsive management and delayed processing for minority-owned accounts were buried under vague notes like resolved or client miscommunication. One internal memo caught Renee's attention. It was from Greg himself, a directive sent 6 months earlier. Flag all large withdrawals over $25,000 for enhanced verification, it read, especially when the account holder isn't a regular visitor. The instruction seemed harmless at first glance, but the auditors noticed something else. Every flagged case involved a Black or Hispanic client. Not one involved a white client of similar standing. Renee's jaw tightened. She forwarded the memo straight to Denise. When Denise received it, she read it twice, then placed her phone face down on the desk. She'd dealt with discrimination her whole life, subtle forms, polite versions, always wrapped in the language of policy. But this was a documented pattern. She called Darius Holden, her corporate lawyer. We're going to expand the audit, she said. Every branch, every region. I want the data public, Darius hesitated. That's a declaration of war, Denise. You sure you want that heat? I'm not starting a war, she said quietly. I'm exposing one that's already been waged in silence. That afternoon, Greg received another call, this time from corporate. His superior's voice was clipped, formal. Mr. Whitman, until further notice, you are suspended pending investigation. He froze. Suspended? I've worked here for 12 years. And you'll have your chance to explain, the voice replied. But given Ms. Parker's documentation and your previous record, we can't risk further liability. My previous record? Greg asked, stunned. There was a pause. You've had 2 prior complaints, haven't you? One from an elderly customer, another from a small business owner in Savannah. Both settled quietly. You should have learned from them. The line went dead. Greg sat in silence for a long time, staring at his reflection in the dark screen of his monitor. For the first time, the bank felt like a cage. He looked around at the plaques, the certificates, the framed letter from his district manager praising his professionalism. They suddenly meant nothing. The same arrogance that had once made him feel untouchable now made him feel exposed. Meanwhile, Laura Keene sat at home that evening, scrolling through news alerts. Word had spread that Parker Innovations had launched a compliance partnership with Crescent National. The articles praised Denise Parker's leadership in improving transparency in financial institutions. No one outside the bank knew what had sparked it, but inside those walls, everyone did. Laura thought about the way Denise had stood there, not angry, not defensive, just certain. She'd seen a lot of customers lose their composure under Greg's scrutiny. Denise hadn't flinched once. By the following week, the audit's findings reached national media. Crescent National's board scrambled to issue statements about new training initiatives and diversity reform. Greg's name wasn't mentioned publicly, but internally everyone knew he was the example being made. At Parker Innovations, Denise's staff watched as her strategy unfolded like a quiet symphony. She never raised her voice. She didn't threaten. She simply documented everything, matched every policy against its own contradictions, and let the truth speak louder than outrage ever could. Renee entered her office one afternoon with a faint smile. You're trending on business networks, she said. They're calling you the CEO who made a bank apologize without saying a word. Denise looked up from her laptop. Good, Maybe they'll learn silence can be power too. Renee hesitated. There's something else. Greg Whitman reached out. He wants to meet. Denise raised an eyebrow. With me? He said he wants to apologize. Denise was quiet for a long moment. Tell him I'll meet him tomorrow morning here. The next day, Greg arrived at Parker Innovations. He looked smaller than before, or maybe it was just the way he carried himself now. Shoulders slightly hunched, tie loosened. He was escorted to the executive conference room where Denise sat reviewing documents. Ms. Parker, he said softly. Mr. Whitman, she replied, without looking up. Please sit. He sat across from her, clasping his hands. I wanted to say I'm sorry, truly. I was wrong to treat you the way I did. I didn't recognize you and I made assumptions. Denise finally met his eyes. You didn't need to recognize me to treat me with respect, Mr. Whitman. He nodded, shame flickering in his expression. You're right. I've been reevaluating a lot lately. Good, Denise said. That's the purpose of reflection. But understand this isn't about one incident. It's about a culture that allowed you to feel justified. Greg swallowed hard. I know, and I want to make it right. If there's anything I can do... There is, Denise interrupted gently. Tell your story. Not to me, but to your peers. Admit what you did and why. People learn from honesty, not humiliation. He blinked, surprised. You're not filing charges? No, she said. You've already been tried by your own conscience. Greg exhaled shakily, emotion cracking his voice. Thank you. You didn't have to show me that mercy. I'm not doing it for you, she replied. I'm doing it for everyone who won't get the chance I had to fight back. He nodded slowly, understanding. Then I'll do it. I'll talk. I owe you that. Denise watched him leave, her face unreadable. When the door closed, she turned to the window, the city shimmering beyond the glass. There was satisfaction, yes, but not victory. What she'd started wasn't about one man's downfall. It was about exposing the quiet prejudice that hid behind corporate smiles and dress codes. And she knew the work wasn't over. That evening, she received a message from Harold. Proud of you, it read. You handled it the right way. She typed back, justice doesn't always need noise. Sometimes it just needs light. 2 months later, Crescent National Bank rolled out a nationwide training reform. Their CEO publicly thanked the collaboration with Parker Innovations for initiating systemic improvements. Denise was invited to speak at a financial ethics summit, where she began her address with a line that silenced the crowd. Change doesn't begin with outrage. It begins when people finally see what they've been trained to overlook. She told the story not as a personal attack, but as a lesson in empathy and accountability. When she finished, there was a long pause, then thunderous applause. Somewhere in the audience, Laura Keene watched from the back row, tears in her eyes. She'd left Crescent National and joined a nonprofit that helped underrepresented communities access banking resources. She still remembered that morning vividly, and how one woman's calm had reshaped an entire institution. As Denise stepped off the stage, Renee caught up to her. You did it, she said quietly. You turned an insult into an industry shift, Denise smiled. We did it, and we're not done yet. Outside, the evening light bathed the city in gold. She paused for a moment, watching people cross the street, strangers moving through their own stories. Unaware they were walking past a woman who had just changed the rules of an entire system. Denise Parker adjusted her coat, her expression serene. The world would keep testing her. But that was fine. She had built her life on proving people wrong, not with anger, but with excellence. And every time someone underestimated her, they only gave her another reason to show them how power truly looked when it wore grace. In the weeks that followed, the ripples from Denise Parker's encounter at Crescent National Bank grew into waves that neither she nor the bank's board could contain. What had started as one manager's arrogance had become a story about power, bias, and the shifting balance between corporate accountability and reputation. Inside the sleek headquarters of Crescent National, meetings were held behind closed doors, statements were rehearsed, and emails marked confidential multiplied like fireflies in a dark field. Publicly, the bank was calm. Internally, it was chaos. The chairman, a man named William Dalton, had built his empire on the illusion of control. But now, he found himself watching a woman he'd once dismissed in board meetings hold more moral authority than his entire PR department. We need to get ahead of this, he said during one meeting, his voice brittle with fatigue. We cannot afford to let her define the narrative. Across the table, his communications director hesitated. Sir, with respect she already has. Denise Parker hadn't sought headlines. She never granted interviews. Yet somehow her silence spoke louder than any press release. Reporters described her as the woman who made a bank apologize without suing it. Pieces debated whether she'd intentionally orchestrated the exposure or whether the system had simply cracked under the weight of its own hypocrisy. But those who knew Denise, people like Renee, Darius, and Harold, understood her motives were simpler. She hadn't done it for glory. She'd done it to prove that dignity, when combined with precision, could be the most powerful weapon in business. At Parker Innovations, Denise's days moved with quiet intensity. The morning sunlight cut through her glass office, catching the gold edges of framed awards and plaques she rarely looked at. What mattered to her wasn't what she'd achieved, but what she could change next. She stood at the window watching the city move below when her assistant entered.
"Ms. Parker, the Department of Financial Oversight wants to schedule a call," Renee said.
"They're asking for your input on new consumer protection guidelines." Denise turned slowly. "Already?" Renee nodded. "They said your recent initiative inspired internal discussions at the federal level." Denise exhaled softly. "Good. Maybe something useful will come out of all this." That same afternoon, she joined a virtual meeting with the department's senior committee. Faces appeared in neat rows on her screen: regulators, policy advisors, industry experts. They greeted her with the kind of deference usually reserved for public officials. "Ms. Parker," one of them began, "your company's audit prompted significant discourse about discriminatory banking practices. We'd like your perspective on reform implementation." Denise leaned forward slightly. "Reform begins where denial ends," she said. "You can't fix what you refuse to name. Bias isn't always intentional, but systems protect it because it's convenient. Change requires discomfort, especially from those who benefit from the comfort." The room fell silent for a moment. Then another voice spoke. "Would you consider leading an advisory panel?" She smiled faintly. "I'll advise, but I won't perform. If you want change, you'll have to confront your own institutions the way I confronted mine." Across the city, Greg Whitman tried to rebuild what little remained of his professional life. Crescent National had quietly reassigned him to consultant status, which in corporate language meant unemployable without embarrassment. He spent his days rereading emails, drafting apology letters, and scrolling through job postings that felt beneath him. His world had shrunk to the size of his guilt. One evening, while clearing out his desk, he found the small recorder Denise had left behind, the one she'd used to document their encounter. It was still on, still blinking red. For a long moment he just stared at it. Then for the first time he pressed play. Her voice filled the silence. Calm, deliberate, unshaken. Hearing it again, stripped of the tension of that day, he realized how measured she'd been, how much grace she'd offered in the face of his condescension. He'd thought she was showing restraint out of fear. Now he understood it had been control. He sat back in his chair, rubbing his face. "You idiot," he muttered to himself. Meanwhile, media interest continued to grow. Business networks invited analysts to dissect the Parker effect. One headline read, "When Calm Becomes Power, How a CEO Redefined Corporate Accountability." Another called her the quiet revolution of the boardroom. Denise ignored them all. She didn't want fame. Fame distorted truth, and truth was all she'd ever needed. At the same time, not everyone was celebrating her rise. Behind the polished doors of Crescent National's upper management, resentment brewed. A few executives whispered that Denise had embarrassed them intentionally, that she'd used her influence to humiliate the bank. One regional vice president, a man named Richard Vaughn, began lobbying to have Crescent National cut ties with Parker Innovations altogether. "She's not a partner anymore," he said in one meeting. "She's a liability." Dalton listened silently before finally saying, "She's the reason this company still has a reputation left. Don't confuse exposure with betrayal." When word of those discussions reached Denise, she didn't flinch. She'd seen the corporate playbook too many times. When power shifts, people pretend integrity was a trap. Still, she decided to confront the issue head-on. She scheduled a meeting with the bank's board, not to threaten, but to remind them what leadership actually looked like. On the morning of the meeting, the boardroom was packed. Executives in dark suits, lawyers, compliance officers, all waiting to see what the woman who had unintentionally reshaped their public image would say. Denise entered quietly, carrying only a slim folder. She didn't shake hands or exchange pleasantries. When she spoke, her voice was steady, deliberate. "I didn't come here to discuss contracts," she began. "I came to discuss credibility. You can build your wealth on policy, but you sustain it on trust, and trust doesn't survive arrogance." Dalton leaned forward. "Ms. Parker, we appreciate your perspective, but we're already taking steps to improve training and oversight." "I'm sure you are," Denise said. "But culture doesn't change through memos. It changes through accountability. When your employees treat people differently based on perception, it's not training they lack, it's empathy. You can't teach empathy in a seminar. It comes from leadership." A few board members shifted uncomfortably. Dalton cleared his throat. "You're suggesting we overhaul our management structure?" "I'm suggesting you remember who you serve," Denise said. "The same customers who built your brand are the ones you've ignored. I'm giving you the chance to prove this institution deserves its name again." Her words hung in the air like judgment and mercy intertwined. Dalton studied her for a long moment before finally nodding. "Understood." When she left, no one spoke for several seconds. Then one board member muttered, "She should be running this bank." Outside the building, the afternoon sun glinted off the glass towers. Reporters waited on the sidewalk, but Denise didn't stop. She moved through the crowd with quiet focus, her phone buzzing with messages she ignored. Power wasn't about attention, it was about purpose, and hers was just beginning. Later that week, she received an email from a woman named Alicia Monroe, a former client of Crescent National. "Ms. Parker," it began, "I saw what you did. I run a small business, and they denied my loan last year without clear reason. I thought I was the problem. Now I know I wasn't, thank you." Denise read it twice, then forwarded it to Renee with a note. "Collect these stories. I want data, not praise." Over the next month, Parker Innovations compiled hundreds of similar messages small business owners, elderly customers, women who had faced subtle barriers in accessing their own funds. Denise didn't post them publicly. Instead, she created a report titled "The Hidden Cost of Assumption" and submitted it to the National Banking Consortium. It was 40 pages of evidence, policy flaws, and recommendations written not as condemnation, but as guidance. Within weeks, the report became mandatory reading across multiple financial institutions. In one televised panel, a moderator asked her, "Ms. Parker, do you consider yourself an activist?" Denise smiled faintly. "No, I consider myself responsible." When the cameras turned off, the moderator leaned closer. "Off the record, what really drove you to push this?" Denise's answer was quiet. "I remembered what it felt like to be invisible, and I realized I could make someone else seen." While she was reshaping an industry, Greg Whitman was rebuilding his soul. He'd started volunteering at a local financial literacy center, teaching young people about credit, savings, and personal finance. He never mentioned his former title. Sometimes, when he spoke about ethics, he would pause mid-sentence as if reliving something he couldn't quite put into words. One evening, as the class ended, a teenager approached him. "Mr. Whitman," she said, "why do you care so much about this stuff?" He smiled sadly. "Because I once forgot what money's supposed to represent trust. And someone reminded me." By the end of the year, Crescent National's reputation had stabilized, but its hierarchy looked different. 2 senior executives quietly resigned. The board created a diversity council and appointed Renee Carter as a consulting director. Parker Innovations continued its growth, securing contracts in sectors beyond finance. And Denise, ever composed, ever deliberate, became a symbol of reform done right. But in private, she often thought about the day it all began. That morning at the teller window, the disbelief in Laura's eyes, the quiet arrogance in Greg's voice. The moment she realized that power wasn't about wealth, it was about how people reacted when they thought you had none. One evening, Harold visited her office again. "You changed more than a policy this time," he said. "You changed a mindset." Denise smiled faintly. "Then it's a start. But there's always another Greg somewhere." Harold chuckled. "Maybe. But there's only one Denise Parker." She looked out the window, the city lights shimmering like a living pulse. "That's the problem," she said softly. "There shouldn't be just one." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the sounds of traffic and ambition across the night. Denise stood there for a long time, her reflection blending with the skyline, a woman who had turned indignity into influence, not through anger, but through the kind of strength that made even the powerful listen. She didn't need revenge. She'd already won the only victory that mattered, proving that grace, wielded precisely, could rewrite the rules of respect. And though she would never say it out loud, everyone who'd ever underestimated her now knew the truth, that sometimes the quietest person in the room isn't powerless at all. She's the one deciding who gets to speak next. Months passed, and Denise Parker's name no longer belonged only to business pages. It had crossed into national conversations about ethics, leadership, and bias. Commentators quoted her lines on morning shows. University classes dissected her decisions as case studies in modern power dynamics. And then one afternoon, the call came that would propel her beyond even her own design. The United States Senate Committee on Financial Conduct wanted her to testify. They were drafting new accountability legislation, and they wanted the woman who had forced one of the country's oldest banks to change itself without litigation. Denise listened quietly as the staffer on the line explained the invitation. "The hearing is next month," he said. "We'd like you to provide insight on corporate transparency and executive responsibility." "Insight," she repeated, half smiling. "That's a polite word for scrutiny." He laughed nervously. "Ma'am, they respect you. They think you can help the country understand where the system fails." She agreed, but with one condition. No pre-written questions, no rehearsed statements. If they wanted truth, they'd get it unfiltered. When she hung up, she sat for a long moment at her desk, staring at the skyline. Beyond the glass, clouds moved like slow ships over the city. She thought about how strange it was that a simple withdrawal had brought her here, to the center of a national reckoning. She picked up her phone and called Renee. "We're going to Washington," she said. The weeks leading up to the hearing were a blur of meetings and briefings. Darius handled legal coordination, combing through potential questions senators might ask. Renee compiled data, graphs, and charts showing the tangible impact of implicit bias in corporate infrastructure. Denise reviewed them, making notes in the margins with her characteristic precision. But privately, she knew this wasn't about data. It was about presence. For many watching, she would symbolize the story of every person who had been dismissed, doubted, or demeaned in the name of procedure. Word of her testimony spread quickly. Some hailed her as a modern reformer. Others whispered that she was becoming too visible, too powerful for the comfort of the establishment. Inside financial circles, there was unease. Quietly, a handful of industry lobbyists began preparing counter-arguments designed to undermine her credibility. They combed through her company's history, looking for weaknesses. A former competitor, eager to score points, leaked half-truths to journalists suggesting Parker Innovations had benefited unfairly from government contracts. It wasn't true, but truth rarely stopped speculation. Denise noticed the shift almost immediately. Journalists began calling for comment. Anonymous posts appeared online questioning her real motives. Darius stormed into her office one morning, waving a tablet. "They're trying to smear you. Look at this nonsense. They're saying you manipulated Crescent National for personal gain." She looked up calmly. "Let them talk. Silence outlasts noise," he frowned. "But these stories can sway the committee." "Only if the committee prefers gossip to evidence," she replied. "And if that's the case, then the system's worse than I thought." The morning of the hearing arrived cold and gray. The Capitol's marble steps gleamed under weak sunlight as reporters crowded the entrance. Denise stepped out of her car wearing a charcoal suit and a quiet expression. Cameras flashed, microphones extended, questions shouted. "Ms. Parker, did you plan the Crescent scandal? Do you believe bias still defines banking? What do you say to your critics?" She didn't answer any of them. Her heels echoed up the stone steps, each click a reminder that she didn't owe explanations to chaos. Inside, the hearing room was packed. Senators sat behind long mahogany desks, their nameplates gleaming beneath the harsh lights. Spectators filled every seat. At the center of it all, Denise sat before a small microphone. Behind her, Renee and Darius took quiet notes. The chairwoman, Senator Ellen Bradford, began formally. "Ms. Parker, thank you for joining us. Your experience has sparked national dialogue on systemic inequity within finance. We'd like to hear your perspective on how institutions can rebuild trust." Denise adjusted the microphone, her voice calm but clear. "Trust isn't rebuilt by slogans," she said. "It's rebuilt by consequences. When misconduct costs nothing, culture never changes. The day a manager can deny service to a customer based on assumption and still keep his job, we haven't progressed. We've decorated the problem." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. One senator leaned forward skeptical. Ms. Parker, are you suggesting that prejudice is still institutionalized in modern finance? I'm not suggesting it, Denise replied evenly. I'm documenting it. It's embedded in hiring practices, in client evaluation models, even in tone of voice. Institutions like to call it policy, but policy without reflection becomes bias with paperwork. Another senator, known for defending corporate interests, crossed his arms. You've benefited from the same system you're criticizing. Your company profits from consulting with these banks, doesn't it? Denise met his gaze without flinching. Yes, Senator. I benefit from fixing the damage your regulations allowed to grow. The room went still. Cameras zoomed in. Bradford hid a faint smile behind her notes. When the hearing ended hours later, the press swarmed again. The clip spread online within minutes. Denise Parker silences senators with 6 words. Corporate grace meets congressional fire. Overnight, her testimony became the most watched committee exchange of the year, but not everyone applauded. Behind the scenes, the smear campaign intensified. A journalist named Hannah Rhodes, young, ambitious, and not easily manipulated, was assigned to cover Parker's rise. She started receiving anonymous envelopes, unsigned documents, supposed proof of financial misdeeds. At first, she ignored them. Then one envelope arrived with a single note. If you care about truth, look deeper. She's not what she seems. Hannah spent nights reviewing every public record of Parker Innovations. What she found surprised her. There was no fraud, no corruption, just an almost obsessive level of compliance. Every contract meticulously documented, every charity donation audited. Whoever was behind the leak wasn't exposing wrongdoing. They were desperate to invent it. She arranged an interview request, and to her surprise, Denise accepted. They met in Parker Innovations' rooftop lounge overlooking the city's lights. Hannah expected defensiveness. Instead, she found composure. They're saying you manipulated the system for fame, Hannah began. Denise poured 2 glasses of water. Then they misunderstand what fame costs. I didn't ask for a spotlight. I asked for fairness. The world just happened to be watching when I did. Hannah studied her. Do you ever regret confronting them? Only that it took me so long, Denise said softly. Silence protects the comfortable. Speaking up protects everyone else. After the interview aired, the smear campaign collapsed under its own weight. Public sentiment shifted again. Even critics admitted they had underestimated her steadiness. Meanwhile, Congress advanced the new Fair Access Act, citing Denise Parker's testimony as the moral blueprint. It was the first major banking reform in a decade, and it carried her fingerprints quietly in every clause. But the success didn't make her complacent. If anything, it unsettled her. She knew how institutions operated, how easily progress could turn into self-congratulation. She kept her focus sharp, channeling new partnerships into programs for financial equity and mentorship. Change dies when it becomes decoration, she often told her staff. We're not painting the walls. We're rebuilding the foundation. One evening, she found herself back at Crescent National's downtown branch. It had been renovated. Brighter colors, friendlier signage, more diverse staff. A plaque near the entrance read, Client Inclusion Initiative, founded 2025. She smiled faintly. Inside, Laura Keene now served as assistant manager. When she saw Denise, her face lit with nervous gratitude. Ms. Parker, I didn't think you'd come back here. Denise glanced around the lobby. You've done well with the place, Laura nodded. We learned. The hard way. Denise looked at her kindly. Learning's never wasted. Keep teaching. They spoke briefly, then Denise stepped back into the sunlight. The city buzzed around her, buses, laughter, the endless hum of movement. For a moment, she felt the quiet satisfaction of seeing something broken mended, but she also felt the weight of what still remained. Later that week, she received an unexpected visitor at her office, Senator Bradford. The older woman smiled as she entered. I came without cameras this time, she said. Denise gestured to a chair. That's the only way real work gets done. Bradford sat. We're forming a permanent advisory council on ethical banking practices. I'd like you to chair it, Denise blinked. Chair it? You've earned it, Bradford said. But more than that, you've proven change can be dignified. We need that voice guiding policy, not just inspiring headlines. Denise considered the offer. If I accept, it has to mean something. I won't sit in meetings that turn real problems into talking points. Bradford smiled. I wouldn't ask you to. When the senator left, Denise stood by the window thinking of how far the path had curved from that single moment of humiliation at a bank counter. Life, she thought, had a way of turning insult into instruction. That night, Harold called. So, Madam Chair? He teased. She laughed. Don't start, I told you. They'd come knocking eventually. I'm not sure I want the job, she admitted. Then that's exactly why you're the right person for it, he said. She hung up smiling. But later, alone, the smile faded into thought. She remembered the trembling voice of Alicia Monroe, the small business owner who'd written to her months earlier. People like Alicia were still out there, still facing locked doors and polite rejections. Titles wouldn't fix that, but accountability could. The next morning, she accepted the appointment. The press release was brief. Denise Parker, CEO of Parker Innovations, appointed to chair the National Council for Financial Ethics. No grand speech, no victory lap. Just another task to be done right. In the following months, Denise spent more time in Washington, navigating hallways lined with ambition and compromise. She learned that changing policy required as much patience as changing hearts. Some officials tried to charm her, others to challenge her, but none could unsettle her balance. In meetings, she spoke with the same calm precision that had once silenced a courtroom. When one executive whispered that she was too idealistic for politics, she simply smiled. Idealism built the bridges you walk on, she said. Maybe it can fix the ones you broke. Her influence grew not through speeches but through consistency. Every proposal she made came backed with research and reason. Every objection she faced she met with clarity, not anger. Slowly, the culture shifted again, not through enforcement but through example. One evening, long after the Capitol lights dimmed, Denise left the building and walked toward the reflecting pool. The air was cool, the city quiet except for distant traffic. She paused at the water's edge, watching her reflection ripple beneath the monument lights. Power, she realized, wasn't a destination. It was a responsibility, one that tested you the moment you thought you'd mastered it. Her phone buzzed, a message from Renee. Heading home. Tomorrow's schedule's packed. 3 media requests, 2 committee calls, and 1 school asking you to speak at graduation. Denise typed back, "Tell the school yes. The rest can wait." As she walked away from the Capitol, she passed a woman sitting on the steps, scrolling through her phone. The woman looked up and recognized her instantly. "Ms. Parker?" she asked, eyes wide. "Thank you for everything you've done." Denise smiled gently. "You're welcome. But remember, it's your turn next." She continued down the quiet street, blending into the city she'd helped reshape, her silhouette fading into the rhythm of headlights and possibility. For Denise Parker, the battle had never been about money. It had always been about worth, the kind that couldn't be measured in numbers, only in how one chose to rise when doubted. And somewhere between the corridors of power and the sidewalks of ordinary life, her story had become more than a lesson. It had become proof that grace, when armed with truth, can rewrite even the oldest systems. The applause of progress never lasts forever. Within a year of Denise Parker's appointment as chair of the National Council for Financial Ethics, her name had become both a symbol of reform and a warning. Banks boasted of adopting her policies in public, while behind closed doors executives grumbled that she had gone too far. Her recommendations on bias audits, executive accountability, and community investment had cut deep into profit margins. For every headline praising her vision, there was another accusing her of overreach. And though she never replied to the noise, Denise knew exactly what was happening. She had made powerful people uncomfortable, and discomfort always organizes itself. It began quietly. Proposals that once passed through committee in days suddenly stalled. Meetings were rescheduled without notice. Documents she requested arrived half-finished or lost in review. When she confronted the delays, she received polite smiles and vague excuses about bureaucratic backlog. But Denise had lived long enough in corporate America to recognize sabotage wrapped in civility. She didn't need anyone to confirm it. The tone of silence said everything. Her closest allies noticed it too. Darius was the first to bring it up. "They're boxing you out," he said one evening in her office. "They're hoping you'll get frustrated and step down." Denise didn't look up from her notes. That would be convenient for them. Renee folded her arms. "So what's the plan?" "The same as always," Denise said. "Stay patient. Let them underestimate me again. She turned to the window, watching the city skyline flicker in the fading light. The moment they think I'm cornered is the moment they reveal themselves. The moment came sooner than she expected. A leaked memo appeared on a major news outlet, a confidential report supposedly written by the council, claiming that Parker Innovations had potential conflicts of interest in its consulting contracts. The implication was clear. Denise had used her influence to secure federal partnerships. Within hours, her name was trending again, this time under accusations of corruption. Renee burst into her office holding her phone. "They're saying you funneled contracts to your own company." Denise remained calm. "They'll realize soon enough that those contracts predated my appointment." "That's not the point," Darius said. "They're trying to stain your name before anyone checks the facts." Denise set her pen down, her voice even. "Then we remind them who I am with evidence, not outrage." She spent the next 48 hours assembling every contract file, every timestamp, every independent audit that proved her integrity. When she finally released her statement, it wasn't through a press conference or social media. It was a 20-page transparency report published directly on Parker Innovations' website, complete with links to public records and signatures of verification from third-party auditors. The statement opened with a single sentence that silenced the speculation. "When truth is your foundation, rumor is just noise." The effect was immediate. Journalists who had rushed to accuse her began quietly retracting their headlines. Even her critics had to admit the evidence was airtight. Yet Denise didn't celebrate. She knew this wasn't the end, it was just the first strike. The next attack came more personal. Someone leaked internal emails from the council, taken out of context to suggest Denise was hostile toward certain executives. Anonymous sources described her as unyielding and intimidating. The press framed it as arrogance. But those who had worked with her knew better. She wasn't hostile, she was thorough. One night, as she sat alone reviewing another batch of correspondence, her mentor Harold called. His voice was softer than usual. "They're scared of you, Denise. That's why they're doing this." "I'm not the threat," she said. "The truth is," he chuckled gently, "you remind me of someone I used to know. A woman who started with nothing but her conviction. She scared people too." Denise smiled faintly. "Did she win?" "In the ways that mattered," Harold said. "But she got tired." "Don't let them make you tired." "I won't," Denise promised, though deep down fatigue had already begun to settle in. It wasn't physical, it was moral. The exhaustion that came from watching people twist integrity into politics. Meanwhile, behind the walls of power, a small alliance of lobbyists and executives met in private. Their strategy was simple: dismantle Denise Parker's credibility one headline at a time. The leader of the group, a banking magnate named Charles Denton, paced the room. "She's changing the conversation," he said. "And once she changes the conversation, she changes the rules. We can't let that happen." One consultant suggested a lawsuit. Another proposed funding think tanks to oppose her reforms under the guise of economic freedom. Denton smiled. "No, we don't fight her directly. We build a narrative that she's too idealistic, too unyielding, too dangerous for business." Their whisper campaign worked quietly, slipping into interviews, reports, and editorials. Overnight, the word uncompromising became both compliment and criticism. But Denise didn't flinch. She'd been called worse by better men. Then one morning, Renee entered her office carrying an envelope. It was unmarked. Inside was a single photo. Denise shaking hands with a foreign trade representative, a perfectly innocent image but accompanied by a typed note. "We can make this look illegal." Renee's hands shook slightly. "This is blackmail." Denise studied the photo. "No," she said calmly. "It's desperation." Darius frowned. "You think they'll actually move forward with it?" "They already have," Denise said, sliding the photo back into the envelope. "That's why we document everything." That evening, she appeared live on national television for the first time since the scandal broke. She didn't wait for the network to frame her story. She framed it herself. Seated across from a veteran journalist, she spoke clearly and calmly, each word measured. "When systems fight accountability," she said, "they don't use truth as their weapon. They use fear. But fear only works on people who forget why they started." The interview went viral within hours. People saw not a woman on defense, but a leader reclaiming her narrative without anger. Comment sections flooded with messages of support. Public faith returned stronger this time, tempered by proof. But for Denise, the deeper victory was quieter. She knew she had just taught the world another lesson, that dignity could withstand even organized cruelty. In the weeks that followed, momentum swung back in her favor. The council's reforms resumed. Media outlets that had once doubted her now invited her for analysis. Universities requested her as guest lecturer. Through it all, she remained unchanged, graceful, precise, controlled. Still, she could feel something stirring in the shadows of success, that familiar pull between purpose and exhaustion. She began spending more evenings in solitude, walking the quiet streets near her apartment. One night, while passing a cafe, she overheard two young women discussing her name. "She's amazing," one said. "She stood up to Congress." "Yeah," the other replied. "But you know how these things go. They'll find a way to tear her down again." Denise smiled sadly to herself. They weren't wrong. The higher you climbed, the less they looked at your work and the more they measured your fall. The next morning, she arrived early at the council office. The hallways were empty, the light faint and gold. She paused outside the boardroom door, staring at the plaque that bore her title, Chair of the National Council for Financial Ethics. It still felt strange seeing it. Titles, she thought, were fragile things too easily used as both armor and target. She touched the plaque once, then entered. Inside, a folder lay waiting on the table. A letter from the president's office inviting her to join a federal advisory task force on economic equality. It was the highest honor of her career and the most dangerous. Accepting would amplify her voice but also her enemies. Declining would look like fear. When Renee and Darius arrived, they found her staring at the letter. "What's wrong?" Renee asked. "Nothing," Denise said. "Just thinking how strange it is that doing the right thing always feels like walking into fire." Darius sat down. "So what's your move?" "The same as before," she said. "Walk through it." By afternoon, the announcement was public. Denise Parker to advise Federal Task Force on Equitable Economics. The stock market barely reacted, but the corridors of power did. Denton and his allies reconvened. "She's untouchable now," one muttered. Denton shook his head. "No one's untouchable. Not forever." But what Denton hadn't understood, what men like him never understood, was that Denise didn't need to be untouchable. She just needed to be unbreakable. Her first meeting with the task force took place in the Eisenhower Executive Building, its walls lined with history and ego. When she entered, conversations quieted. The members, economists, policymakers, and CEOs had read her file, watched her testimony, and already formed their judgments. Some respected her. Others feared her. The chair, a seasoned economist, began the meeting. "We're here to create frameworks for ethical corporate conduct," he said. "But let's be realistic, we can't regulate morality," Denise responded without hesitation. "Then we redefine what realism means. If profit can be measured, so can principle." The room went silent. The chair smiled slightly, realizing she wasn't here to be ornamental. She was here to lead. Weeks turned into months, and Denise once again became the calm center of a storm. Her reports shaped policy. Her words shaped debate. Yet through every meeting, every attack, she kept the same quiet focus that had carried her from a teller counter to the corridors of government. She never raised her voice, never traded insult for insult. And slowly, even her detractors began to respect the inevitability of her presence. One evening, after another long day of negotiations, she stood alone on the White House steps, the night air crisp and still. A security guard nearby nodded to her respectfully. "Ma'am, long day?" She smiled. "The best kind. The kind that means something," he chuckled. "We need more people like you." She looked out at the city lights. "We need fewer reasons to." When she returned to her apartment, she found an email waiting. It was from Greg Whitman. "I saw your testimony again today. You were right about everything. Thank you for the lesson you never meant to give." Denise read it twice, her heart heavy but warm. She typed only 2 words in reply. "You learned." Outside her window, dawn was already creeping across the horizon. The world kept spinning loud, chaotic, divided, but she no longer felt at its mercy. She had found the rarest kind of power, the kind that didn't need permission to exist. And though her fight was far from over, Denise Parker understood something most of her adversaries never would, that the true measure of leadership wasn't how loudly one commanded a room, but how quietly one changed it forever. By the following spring, Denise Parker's name had become shorthand for reform that actually worked. The council's policies had filtered down through regional banks, credit unions, and fintech firms. Loan approval algorithms were being rewritten, diversity training programs had stopped being token checkboxes, and more minority-owned businesses were receiving fair access to capital than at any point in the last 2 decades. But progress, as Denise often said, is the one thing power hates when it isn't its own idea. In Washington, a new tide was turning. Midterm elections had shifted the balance of the Senate, and several incoming members had made quiet promises to roll back excessive oversight. Lobbyists rejoiced. Within weeks, a bill surfaced, framed with patriotic language about protecting economic freedom, that would effectively dissolve the National Council for Financial Ethics. On paper, it was procedural. In reality, it was personal. Everyone in the corridors of influence knew whose work the bill targeted. When Denise heard, she didn't shout, didn't panic. She simply read the proposal 3 times, set the folder down, and said to Renee, "They're finally saying the quiet part out loud." Darius leaned against her doorway. "They're calling it reform fatigue. They think people are tired of accountability." Denise looked up, her expression calm. "Then it's time to remind them why accountability exists in the first place." That evening, she stayed late in the council offices. The city lights reflected on the polished conference table. She drafted a single-page letter addressed to every member of Congress, no pleas, no rhetoric, just facts. How much discrimination had cost the economy, how fair practices had increased consumer trust, how stability had followed transparency. The letter ended with one line that would later be quoted in newspapers worldwide. "If ethics become inconvenient, corruption becomes inevitable." By dawn, the letter had gone viral. But the opposition didn't back down. Charles Denton, the same banking magnate who'd orchestrated the earlier smear campaigns, was now funding political ads claiming Parker's reforms were crippling small lenders. His talking points spread fast. Repetition masqueraded as truth. Denise knew better than to fight propaganda with argument. She fought it with demonstration. She called a press conference, her first in months, and stood before a sea of cameras. Her voice remained low, measured, confident. "Every regulation we passed came from one simple principle," she said. "No American should have to prove they deserve dignity before they can access their own money." Reporters fired questions, but she answered only one. A young journalist asked what she would do if Congress voted to dissolve her council. Denise smiled faintly. "Then we'll continue the work outside the walls they built. Justice doesn't expire with a job title." The quote spread faster than the smear ads. Ordinary citizens, teachers, small business owners, veterans, began posting their own stories under the hashtag "Work Outside the Walls." What had started as a bureaucratic fight transformed into a cultural moment. Yet in the marble halls of Washington, resentment hardened. A week before the vote, Denise was summoned to a closed-door meeting with the Senate Finance Committee. The invitation was formal, but the tone was clear. They wanted to intimidate her into silence. When she arrived, the room was filled with men in tailored suits and calculated smiles. Senator Ridge, one of the bill's architects, gestured toward the seat across from him. "Ms. Parker, thank you for coming. We'd like to discuss the future of your council." Denise sat without a word. Ridge continued, "There's concern your regulations have overstepped. You've disrupted operations for many of our country's most trusted institutions." "Trusted by whom?" she asked quietly. The senator's smile faltered. "By the American people. Then the American people deserve to know those same institutions were investigated for discriminatory lending practices just 2 years ago," she replied. Another senator cleared his throat. "You're very outspoken for someone in a nonpartisan position." Denise leaned forward slightly. "Nonpartisan doesn't mean non-moral." For a few seconds, the room was silent. Ridge finally said, "If you won't cooperate, we may have to review your standing as chair." Denise's gaze didn't waver. "Then review it. But understand this, removing me won't remove the truth. You can dissolve a council, but you can't dissolve awareness." When she left the chamber, aides whispered. Cameras clicked. Even her critics couldn't deny she had dismantled their threats without raising her voice. Still, she knew a vote was coming, and the outcome wasn't guaranteed. That night she met with Harold in a quiet corner of a Georgetown restaurant. The candles flickered against the window as rain streaked down the glass. You've done more than anyone expected, he said. Maybe it's time to step back. Let someone else carry the torch. Denise shook her head. If I step back now, they'll rewrite the story. They'll say reform failed because it was impossible, not because it was resisted. Harold studied her, pride and worry mixing in his eyes. You've always had a gift for turning defiance into grace. It's not defiance, she said softly. It's duty. The night before the vote, Washington buzzed with speculation. Commentators debated whether the council would survive. Polls showed public opinion overwhelmingly in Denise's favor, but lobbyist pressure was heavy. In her hotel room, Denise sat by the window, watching lights flicker across the Potomac. Renee knocked once before entering. Can't sleep? Denise smiled faintly. Haven't tried, Renee hesitated. What if they shut it down? Then we rebuild, Denise said simply. Truth always finds another institution. The next morning, the vote began. She wasn't in the chamber. She refused to make a spectacle of herself. Instead, she waited in her office, the television muted, the city strangely quiet outside. Darius paced the room, checking his phone every few minutes. Renee stood by the door, arms crossed. Finally, the screen flashed the result. Bill 421, motion to dissolve council, fails by 2 votes. Darius let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Renee smiled through tears. You did it, Denise shook her head. We did it, and we only won by 2. That means the next fight starts tomorrow. Within hours, congratulations poured in. The president called personally, thanking her for defending integrity against indifference. But Denise didn't linger on praise. She returned to work the next day as though nothing had happened. Her enemies regrouped, but now even they understood she wasn't a passing headline. She was a force of continuity. Weeks later, she visited an inner-city community center that had benefited from new ethical banking grants. Children ran through the halls. Volunteers stacked boxes of supplies. A young girl approached her shyly. Are you the lady from TV? Denise knelt to the child's height. Sometimes, she said. The girl grinned. My mom said you made the banks nicer. Denise laughed softly. I'm trying. In that small exchange, she felt something that no victory in Washington could match. The reminder that real change lived far from the marble floors of power. But power wasn't finished testing her. That summer, a new scandal erupted. Not hers this time, but tied to one of the same senators who had tried to dismantle the council. Evidence surfaced of offshore accounts, illegal donations, and doctored expense reports. The press drew parallels between his misconduct and Denise's earlier warnings about unchecked power. As investigations unfolded, the senator's office issued a brief statement blaming vindictive reformers. The implication was obvious. Renee stormed into Denise's office with the article in hand. He's blaming you! Denise looked up from her paperwork. Let him. Blame is louder than confession. The scandal grew until the senator resigned. Reporters called the downfall poetic justice. Denise didn't celebrate. She simply said, sometimes truth just takes the long way home. By autumn, the council's work had reached global attention. International banking groups requested consultations. Several countries invited her to speak on ethics and digital finance. During one conference in London, a moderator asked how she managed to stay calm under constant attack. Denise smiled. Because outrage burns energy, and I prefer endurance. After the event, as she walked along the Thames, Harold called again. The world's watching you, Denise. You've built a legacy. She paused on the bridge, watching the water flow beneath. Legacies are dangerous, Harold. They make people stop working. I'm not done yet. When she returned home, another letter awaited her, this one handwritten, the ink slightly smudged. Ms. Parker, I used to work at a bank that turned people away like you once were. I quit last month. I'm starting a small credit service built on your model. You reminded me what integrity looks like. Thank you. Denise folded the letter carefully, placed it in her drawer beside her first business license, and whispered, That's the real profit. As winter approached, the noise around her quieted. Denton retired under the cloud of his own investigations. The council, once fragile, now stood secure, and Denise Parker, who had walked into a bank years ago as just another customer, had become the conscience of an entire industry. Yet even in peace, she stayed vigilant. She knew institutions had short memories and long appetites. Whenever she lectured young entrepreneurs, she ended with the same words. Power will always try to convince you that patience is weakness. It isn't. Patience is preparation. One night, as snow fell softly outside her apartment, Denise sat by the window writing in her journal, something she rarely had time for anymore. Her handwriting was neat, deliberate. Today the world feels quieter, but silence can be a trap. Justice must stay restless. She closed the notebook and looked out at the lights below, knowing she had become what she once needed. Proof that integrity could not only survive power but lead it. In the distance, a church bell struck midnight. She smiled, whispered a prayer of gratitude for every battle she had fought and every lesson it had forced her to learn, then turned off the lamp. Somewhere deep in the city, another young woman, underestimated, overworked, and quietly dreaming, was making a promise to herself without even realizing it. The same kind Denise once made in front of a teller who didn't believe her. And the cycle of quiet defiance, of grace against assumption, began again. By the second year of her chairmanship, Denise Parker had become an international name. Her speeches were quoted in parliaments, her reports cited in universities, and her calm defiance studied by young leaders who believed justice could be engineered like code, precise, scalable, and incorruptible. Invitations arrived from every corner of the world, Singapore, Geneva, Cape Town, Tokyo. But the one that mattered most came from Zurich. The Global Economic Alliance was hosting a summit on ethics and profit in a digital age, and they wanted Denise to deliver the keynote address. At first she hesitated. She'd seen what happened when movements went global, how sincerity dissolved into slogans, how visionaries became mascots for causes they didn't control. Yet something in her told her to accept. The invitation wasn't just recognition. It was opportunity. For the first time, the world's financial leaders would gather under one roof, and she could tell them directly that fairness wasn't a regional experiment, it was the future. The flight to Switzerland was quiet. Renee sat beside her, reviewing notes while Denise gazed out the window at clouds glowing under sunrise. You ever get tired? Renee asked softly. Denise smiled. Every day. But purpose doesn't check the clock. They arrived to a spectacle of formality. Black cars, velvet ropes, men in dark suits greeting one another with the kind of smiles that never reached their eyes. Cameras flashed as Denise stepped onto the blue carpet. For a moment she felt the weight of thousands of eyes, the same mixture of curiosity and skepticism she'd felt walking into that Atlanta bank years ago. Only the building was grander now, the stakes higher. Inside the conference hall, the ceiling shimmered with chandeliers. Delegates whispered as she passed. Some extended hands, others simply watched. A few of her old adversaries were there too, wearing diplomatic civility like perfume. Among them, Charles Denton. He had rebranded himself as a consultant for corporate responsibility. When he approached, she could almost admire the audacity. Ms. Parker, he said smoothly. It's been too long. She shook his hand lightly. Not long enough for some memories to fade. He laughed, pretending not to understand. I must say you've done remarkably well, though I suppose idealism travels better when it's fashionable. Integrity isn't fashion, Mr. Denton, she said, her tone cool. It's currency, and some people are still bankrupt. He smirked but said nothing more. Later, in the green room before her speech, Denise reviewed her notes. The text was simple, 3 pages outlining what she called the ethical dividend, the measurable economic gain of treating people fairly. But as she read, an aide entered looking anxious. Ms. Parker, there's been a development. A leak, her pen froze. What kind of leak? Emails. Someone released correspondence between you and a European NGO. They're twisting it to say you promised favorable trade recommendations in exchange for donations. Renee cursed under her breath. Not again. Denise looked at the aide. How bad? Bad enough. Social media's already picking it up. She took a slow breath. Then we stay calm. Truth first, panic never. 5 minutes later, she walked onto the stage to a hall filled with murmurs. The moderator introduced her with cautious praise, uncertain whether he was welcoming a hero or a headline. The lights dimmed and silence followed. Denise looked out over the sea of faces, CEOs, ministers, economists, and began. I was once refused access to my own money, she said. Not because the numbers didn't match, but because the assumptions did. I learned that day that systems fail in silence, not in scandal. A few heads turned, recognizing the story. People think ethics are sentimental, she continued. They aren't, they're structural. Every unfair decision costs someone's trust, and trust is the backbone of every market on earth. Her voice gathered quiet strength. Some say fairness slows growth. I say exploitation destroys it faster. We can measure GDP to the decimal, but not the cost of dignity lost. As she spoke, phones lit up across the hall with live updates about the leaked emails. She saw the flicker of screens but kept going, her voice steady. Truth doesn't fear evidence. Those who fabricate scandal only prove how much honesty terrifies them. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Then one by one, people stood. The applause started small, then swelled until it filled the entire hall. When she stepped backstage, Renee met her with wide eyes. You just buried their story, Denise exhaled slowly. No, I just reminded them who writes the real one. That night, international news outlets replayed the speech endlessly. Headlines declared, Denise Parker turns attack into lesson on integrity. But while the world cheered, a quieter drama unfolded behind the scenes. A Swiss prosecutor announced a preliminary review of the leaked emails, a standard procedure, but one her enemies spun as proof of suspicion. For the first time in years, Denise felt the faint sting of weariness. She wasn't worried about the outcome. She was tired of the cycle. Truth, lie, correction, repeat. Each victory demanded another battle. Back in her hotel suite, she sat by the window overlooking Lake Zurich, her reflection superimposed over the dark water. Renee entered softly. You should rest. Tomorrow's interviews, I know, Denise interrupted gently. Do me a favor, Renee. Book a return flight for Friday. No media stops. I want to go home, Renee nodded. Home it is. The next morning, her phone buzzed with a call from Harold. His voice, steady as ever, carried across the ocean. You handled it perfectly, Denise. I saw the whole speech, she smiled faintly. You taught me to never argue with a liar. Just let truth outlast them. He chuckled. You've outlasted plenty. Then his tone softened. Don't forget to live too. For the next few days, the investigation in Zurich unfolded quietly. The NGO confirmed the emails had been altered. The prosecutor cleared her within a week. But Denise already knew the truth didn't travel as fast as rumor. By the time exoneration arrived, the next scandal somewhere else had stolen the world's attention. Back in the United States, she returned to her office at Parker Innovations. The familiar skyline steadied her. Renee greeted her with coffee and a relieved grin. The Swiss cleared everything. You're officially untouchable again. Denise laughed softly. No one's untouchable, Renee. That's the lesson everyone forgets. She spent the next months refocusing on what grounded her. The programs she'd built to help small businesses, the mentorship initiatives for young Black women in finance, the scholarships in her parents' names. Publicly, she was a global icon. Privately, she was rebuilding peace. One afternoon, while reviewing applications for the scholarship fund, she paused on an essay from a student named Alana Griffin. The essay began, I want to be the kind of woman who walks into a room and makes arrogance rethink itself. Denise smiled, tears welling unexpectedly. She read the line again, whispering, Then you already are. But peace never stayed permanent in her life. 6 months later, she was invited to another summit, this time in Washington, to unveil a joint declaration on ethical investment. Charles Denton was listed as a panelist. She almost declined, but then remembered something Harold once said. Avoiding the table doesn't stop the conversation. It just removes your chair. The day of the summit, the tension was palpable. Denton sat across from her on stage, charming as ever, spinning rehearsed lines about balanced oversight and shared responsibility. When it was Denise's turn, she began softly. Balance without accountability isn't fairness, she said. It's comfort dressed as virtue. We can't share responsibility until we share consequences. The audience leaned in. Denton tried to interrupt, but she continued. For decades, institutions have been telling the public to trust them. Maybe it's time those institutions ask what they've done to earn it. Applause cut through the room. Denton's composure cracked. After the event, he approached her privately. You made your point, Parker. Enjoy it while it lasts. The world always turns back to profit. She looked at him calmly. And yet I'm still here, he smirked. For now. That night, while driving home, she replayed his words. For now. It wasn't a threat, it was a reminder. Change was never permanent. It was something you had to keep defending, quietly and endlessly. Weeks later, a massive cyber attack hit several international banks, exposing years of unethical transactions. Reporters drew direct connections to the very networks Denton represented. Investigations began again, this time without Denise saying a single word. Her silence had become prophecy. As markets trembled, she addressed the nation in a brief televised statement. "We've built systems so complex they can hide almost anything except truth. And truth, when uncovered, doesn't ask permission to ruin the wrong people." In that moment, Denise Parker stopped being a reformer and became something rarer, a moral constant. The world no longer waited for her reaction. It measured its own by her example. Late one evening, long after the cameras stopped rolling, she sat alone on her office balcony. The city pulsed below, alive with motion and noise, the same city where years earlier she'd been treated like an outsider to her own wealth. She thought of the teller, of Greg Whitman, of how one small humiliation had become the spark that reshaped an industry. She whispered into the night, half prayer, half gratitude. "Thank you for that, no." Then she closed her eyes, listening to the quiet hum of traffic and life, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to rest, not in defeat, not in vigilance, but in peace earned honestly, because Denise Parker had finally proven something no law could legislate and no power could suppress. That grace, when tested enough times, becomes justice. And justice, once awakened, never goes back to sleep. The year Denise Parker turned 50, her name had become a fixture in boardrooms, classrooms, and even political speeches. Presidents quoted her. Corporations tried to imitate her language, but imitation wasn't the same as conviction. She could feel it in the air, that slow, seductive pressure to soften, to compromise, to make her message safer. The world was comfortable again, and comfort was always the enemy of change. By now, Parker Innovations had expanded into 3 continents. Her consulting branches advised banks, insurance companies, and public institutions on transparency and social accountability. But the more she succeeded, the lonelier the work became. The world didn't mind being told it could do better until someone actually started making it do better. In early March, she received an invitation that would pull her into the most delicate negotiation of her career. The Global Financial Compact, a newly formed alliance of the world's largest banking networks, wanted her to serve as ethics director for a multi-billion-dollar equitable growth initiative. On paper, it was exactly the kind of reform she'd dreamed of. But the fine print told another story. Oversight limited to advisory status, no voting power, and most of her transparency clauses reduced to recommendations. It wasn't an offer. It was a silencing disguised as a promotion. When she read the proposal, she felt an old, familiar heat behind her calm exterior, the same quiet anger she'd felt standing in that marble bank years ago. She looked across her office at Renee, who was pacing with her phone in hand. "They want you on the cover of their reform," Renee said. "Not in charge of it." "I know," Denise replied. "They want credibility, not accountability. So what do? We read every line. Then we decide how loudly to say no." Over the next week, calls flooded in from every direction. Politicians, CEOs, even journalists tried to persuade her. "You'll have global influence," they said. "You'll be inside the system this time." Denise would just smile and answer, "I don't need to be inside a system that only wants me as its decoration." But the pressure didn't stop. When she declined the initial offer, the compact revised the terms: a larger salary, greater visibility, vague promises of future authority. Darius reviewed the documents and shook his head. "They're buying silence by the pound." Harold, ever the realist, urged caution. "Denise, sometimes you have to play the long game. Take the seat, get in the door, then move the walls from within." She listened quietly before answering. "Harold, they built the door knowing it leads nowhere. I won't walk through it just because it's gilded." The tension followed her everywhere. News outlets speculated endlessly. Will Parker join the compact? Analysts debated whether she was sabotaging her influence by staying independent. Investors warned that declining could isolate her company. Still, she refused to budge. Then one night she received a private visit. It was Charles Denton, older now, visibly worn, but still carrying that polished arrogance that seemed permanent. He joined the compact's board as an advisor. When he entered her office unannounced, Renee looked ready to throw him out, but Denise gestured for her to wait. Denton smiled, settling into a chair across from her. Still running the world with your quiet speeches, I see. Denise folded her hands. And you're still trying to own it with other people's mistakes. He laughed softly. Touché. Look, Denise, I'm not here to fight. I'm here to offer perspective. The compact isn't the enemy. It's evolution. The system is changing. It just needs someone like you to help it without burning it down. She leaned back slightly. And you think my silence is the price of progress? Not silence, Denton said smoothly. Strategy. If you're inside, you can influence them quietly. Out here, you're a symbol, not a decision maker. Denise tilted her head. Symbols last longer than executives. He smirked, standing. That's poetic. But poetry doesn't write policy. Think about it. When he left, the room felt heavier. The kind of heaviness that came not from threats, but from choices. That night, Denise couldn't sleep. She walked through her apartment barefoot, her reflection flickering in the tall windows. She thought about the path that had brought her here, the teller who doubted her, the boardrooms she'd silenced, the policies she'd changed. Every victory had come with cost, sleepless nights, endless scrutiny, the erosion of privacy. She wondered how long one person could stand in resistance before turning into what they resisted, an institution, safe but soulless. By morning, she had her answer. She called Renee and Darius to her office. We're not joining the compact, she said. We're building an alternative. Renee blinked. An alternative? Denise nodded. A network of independent financial institutions, ethical, transparent, community-driven. Small at first, but scalable. If the giants won't change, we'll outgrow them. Darius grinned. You're declaring independence from the global banking system. Denise smiled. No, I'm reminding it who gave it permission to exist. Within months, the idea took shape. The Equitrust Network, a cooperative alliance of ethical finance firms, began forming across North America and Europe. Every partner agreed to full disclosure, diverse leadership, and transparent lending. It was radical not because it was new, but because it was honest. The compact dismissed it as a publicity stunt, calling it unsustainable idealism. But the public thought otherwise. Within a year, Equitrust had over 1 million private clients and partnerships with universities, small businesses, and minority-owned startups. People wanted to believe again, and Denise had given them something tangible to believe in. Still, the backlash was fierce. The compact's influence ran deep, and soon enough, whispers of regulation surfaced. Governments, under pressure from major banks, began questioning the legality of Denise's network. Anonymous editorials called her a populist in a business suit. One morning, as she reviewed the latest reports, Renee entered with grim eyes. They're filing an injunction, she said. They're claiming Equitrust poses a risk to market stability. Denise laughed softly. Of course they are. Stability is their favorite word for monopoly. The case escalated fast. Within weeks, Denise found herself summoned to an international hearing in Brussels. The charge wasn't criminal but reputational, an attempt to undermine her leadership by questioning her financial model. When she arrived at the tribunal, she felt the same stillness she always carried into conflict. Reporters shouted her name. Flashbulbs flickered like lightning. She stepped inside and faced a semicircle of officials representing the compact's interests. One of them asked the question they'd all been waiting to hear. Ms. Parker, do you admit that your network threatens the established economic order? Denise didn't blink. If fairness threatens your order, maybe it's the order that's unstable. The chamber fell silent. Cameras clicked. The hearing was over before it began. That quote ran on every headline the next day. And in the weeks that followed, public sentiment shifted again. Ordinary citizens, weary of scandals and broken promises, rallied behind her. Governments hesitated to pursue further action, fearing backlash. The compact's momentum faltered, but victory came with an invisible cost. Behind the applause, Denise felt the slow creep of exhaustion again. For years, she had fought every battle with grace, never breaking, never retreating. Now, for the first time, she wondered what came after winning. One evening, Harold visited her at home. His hair had gone gray, his gait slower, but his wisdom was as sharp as ever. They sat in her living room, the city lights painting soft reflections on the walls. You've built an empire of conscience, he said. But even empires need heirs. Denise smiled faintly. You think I should retire? I think you should rest, Harold said gently. You've proven the point 100 times over. Let someone else carry it forward. She looked down at her hands, still strong but lined with time. You ever stop believing that rest is a luxury for other people? He chuckled. All the time. But that's how you know you've done enough. After he left, Denise stood by the window, watching the skyline that had once intimidated her. She thought about the young women who now quoted her speeches, the students who wore her name on scholarship plaques, the quiet revolution that had begun with a single moment of doubt. She realized then that legacy wasn't about being remembered. It was about leaving proof that integrity could outlive its author. The next morning, she made an announcement that stunned the world. In a brief press statement, she declared she would step down as chair of the council and CEO of Parker Innovations by year's end. Leadership isn't ownership, she said. It's stewardship, and every steward must one day pass the torch. Reporters begged for interviews. Headlines speculated endlessly. Some called it a graceful exit. Others claimed she was tired. Only a few understood the truth that she wasn't leaving out of fatigue, but fulfillment. Renee hugged her after the press conference. You really did it, didn't you? You changed everything. Denise smiled softly. Not everything. Just enough to remind the next generation that they can. That evening, she walked through her office one last time. The walls held photos from milestones, policy meetings, community projects, the Zurich summit, even the quiet snapshots with her team. As she turned off the lights, she whispered a single sentence into the dark. Power was never the prize. Outside, the city moved as it always had, loud, alive, unbothered. But somewhere beneath its rhythm, in every branch that changed its policy, every entrepreneur who dared to lead differently, every student who learned her name, the echo of her grace still lingered. Because Denise Parker had not simply survived power. She had rewritten what it meant to hold it. The day Denise Parker officially stepped down from Parker Innovations, the city felt different. Not quieter, just slower, like it was exhaling with her. Reporters gathered outside the company's headquarters, but she didn't make a grand exit. No convoy, no final speech, just a woman in a simple black coat walking through the revolving doors for the last time. She carried no briefcase, no folders, only a small silver pen her mother had given her when she started her first job decades ago. Engraved on the side were 3 words, "Earn it daily." She had lived by them every single day. Inside, the employees had lined the lobby without being asked. When she entered, they didn't clap right away. They just stood, hundreds of them, in silence. Then one young woman near the front began to applaud, and the sound spread like a rising tide. Renee was the first to step forward. Tears glistened on her cheeks as she handed Denise a small box. "For you," she said. Inside was a brass plaque engraved with her favorite quote, "Grace is the final form of power." Denise looked around the room and smiled. Keep building. Keep arguing. Keep believing. The moment you stop questioning the world is the moment you start serving it. Then she turned and walked out. She didn't look back. For the first time in 30 years, Denise Parker had no meetings on her calendar. No speeches, no interviews, no hearings. The stillness was disorienting at first. She spent mornings walking through the park, afternoons in cafes reading books she hadn't touched in years. Some recognized her and waved shyly. Others didn't notice her at all, which she secretly loved. She had become an ordinary citizen again, and it felt both foreign and free. One evening, as she sipped tea on her balcony, her phone buzzed. It was Harold calling from Florida. His voice was slower now, age catching up, but the warmth was still there. "So, how's retirement?" he asked. "I'm not sure," Denise said. "I keep thinking of all the things I should be doing. It's hard to stop fixing things when you've spent your life fixing them." Harold chuckled. "Then maybe it's time to start teaching instead of fixing." She smiled. "Maybe you're right." The next morning, she emailed a few universities about guest lecturing. Within a week, she received invitations from 3, including one from her old alma mater, Clark Atlanta University. They wanted her to teach a short seminar on leadership and ethics. Denise accepted without hesitation. Her first class was packed. Students filled every seat, notebooks ready, phones recording. When she entered, the room fell silent. She didn't introduce herself. Everyone already knew who she was. She wrote 2 words on the board, moral math. "Everyone here knows financial math," she said. Numbers, margins, returns. But there's another kind, moral math. The calculation of cost when the numbers don't show it. Every decision you make has a moral remainder, something left over after profit and loss. That remainder is what defines you. The students hung on her every word. She spoke not like a professor, but like someone telling them the secrets of survival. When the class ended, a young man approached her. "Ms. Parker," he said, nervous but determined. "How do you stay ethical when everyone around you tells you it's naive?" She smiled. "You don't stay ethical because it's easy. You stay ethical because you can't respect yourself otherwise. Power without conscience is just noise." After he left, she stood in the empty classroom for a while, feeling something she hadn't felt in years, peace without performance. Over the next semester, Denise found a rhythm. She taught, wrote, mentored. For the first time, she laughed freely without cameras waiting to dissect her expressions. She began gardening, painting, and once again visiting the small community bank where it had all begun. The building had changed, renovated, brighter, but the memory of that morning years ago still lived in the marble. She stood near the counter where Greg Whitman once questioned her. The new manager, a young Latina woman, approached her with recognition in her eyes. "Ms. Parker?" Denise nodded. The woman smiled. "We have you to thank for this branch still existing. We teach your story and training." Denise felt her chest tighten. "I'm glad something good came out of that day." "It did," the manager said. "We all learned what dignity looks like." As Denise walked out into the afternoon sun, she realized something profound. She had stopped chasing impact. It was chasing her now, but peace never stayed untested. One morning, Renee called with urgency in her voice. "You might want to check the news," she said. Denise turned on the television. The headline made her stomach drop. "Parker Foundation faces mismanagement probe." The foundation, her philanthropic branch run by a new board since her retirement, was under investigation for misused funds. She hadn't been involved for months, but her name was still on every banner, every donation certificate. Reporters pounced immediately. Commentators speculated about her legacy unraveling. Old critics resurfaced with smug tones of vindication. Denise didn't panic, but she did feel something deeper: disappointment. Not in herself, but in how easily people turned principles into branding. She called Darius. "Tell me everything." "The foundation's new director made some bad investments," he explained. "Nothing illegal yet, but it looks bad. They used your reputation to attract donors, and now they're hiding behind your image." Denise took a long breath. "Then we fix it quietly." Within hours, she was back in the conference room she thought she'd left behind. Not as a leader this time, but as a witness to what her absence had allowed. She demanded a full audit and met with the board in person. When they tried to deflect blame, she stopped them cold. "I built this on trust," she said, her voice low but cutting. "And you turned trust into currency. That ends today." One of the executives tried to protest. "Miss Parker, we didn't mean—" "Intentions don't repair harm," she interrupted. "Action does." By the end of the week, the entire board had resigned. Denise installed a temporary oversight committee composed of educators and community leaders. The press called it a comeback. She called it cleanup. Still, the ordeal left her shaken. Late one night, Harold called again. "You okay?" "I'm fine," she said softly. "It's just strange. I spent my whole life proving people wrong. Now I'm proving myself right all over again." He chuckled. "Legacy's a moving target, but you're still hitting it." A few months later, the foundation was cleared. The funds were recovered, new leadership installed, and public faith restored. But Denise had learned something she hadn't expected, that even legacy needs maintenance. Without vigilance, ideals can be stolen by the very people who praise them. One afternoon after class, she stayed behind to talk with a student named Camille. The young woman looked nervous. "Miss Parker, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course," Camille hesitated. "A lot of people talk about your courage. But weren't you ever scared?" Denise smiled gently. "Every day. Courage isn't about not feeling fear. It's about deciding something else matters more." Camille nodded slowly. "I want to do what you did someday." Denise looked at her, seeing in her the same spark she once carried: raw, untested, relentless. "Then promise me one thing," she said softly. "When they tell you to wait your turn, don't. Change doesn't have a schedule." That night, as Denise walked home under the soft glow of streetlights, she felt something lighter than pride: continuity. The sense that the fight didn't end with her. It had simply changed hands. Back in her apartment, she opened the small wooden box that held her mother's pen. She ran her thumb over the engraved words. "Earn it daily." She smiled. On her desk sat a letter, an invitation to deliver a commencement address at Clark Atlanta's graduation ceremony. She hadn't spoken publicly in over a year. This time it felt right. A few weeks later, she stood on stage in front of thousands of graduates dressed in black and gold. The sky above was bright with spring. She looked out at the sea of faces, young, hopeful, unbroken, and began. "I used to think power was something you achieved," she said. "Then I learned it's something you prove every time you choose fairness when it's easier to be silent." She paused, letting the breeze carry her words across the field. "One day each of you will be underestimated. That's your moment. Because being underestimated is freedom. No one sees you coming." The crowd erupted in laughter and applause. "And when you do arrive," she continued, her voice softening, "arrive with integrity, arrive with grace, arrive so prepared that doubt becomes irrelevant." As she stepped away from the podium, the applause thundered. Students stood chanting her name. Somewhere in that roar, Denise felt both closure and renewal. She had started as a woman denied access to her own bank account. Now she had deposited her values into an entire generation. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low, she sat alone on the campus steps. Renee found her there, smiling. "You did it again," she said. Denise looked at the empty stage and shook her head. "No," she whispered. They did. The campus bells rang in the distance, and she closed her eyes. For the first time, she didn't think about what came next. She didn't need to. The work, her real work, was already in motion, carried forward by those who had listened, learned, and decided they, too, would never let arrogance go unchallenged. In the quiet dusk of that Georgia evening, Denise Parker finally allowed herself to feel what she had denied for years. Not victory, not pride, just peace, the kind that comes only when you know the world will keep changing, even after you stop pushing it. Spring arrived quietly that year. Atlanta's dogwoods bloomed early, soft white petals drifting across the sidewalks outside Denise Parker's townhouse. She had learned to love mornings again, no alarms, no security briefings, just the smell of coffee and the sound of her neighborhood waking up. For the first time in decades, her calendar was empty by design. She had told herself she was done with the public stage, and she meant it. The world had its new voices now, young women and men she had mentored, who carried her lessons further than she ever could. She followed their work from afar, smiling when she saw their names attached to reforms, awards, and companies that treated fairness as fact rather than slogan. It felt good to disappear a little. One crisp morning, while watering her balcony plants, her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was soft, uncertain. "Ms. Parker? You probably don't remember me. My name's Laura Keene." Denise blinked. "Laura from Crescent National?" "Yes, ma'am," Laura said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm managing the regional division now, and we're opening a new branch, one built completely around the inclusive model you designed years ago. We'd be honored if you'd attend the dedication ceremony." For a moment, Denise didn't answer. The irony was almost poetic. She had once stood in that very lobby as a stranger, unwelcome in her own bank. Now they wanted her name carved into its cornerstone. She smiled faintly. "Send me the details," she said. "I'll be there." When the day came, the ceremony was small but dignified. The new Crescent National branch stood downtown, glass walls, open offices, community artwork on every floor. A plaque near the entrance bore her name alongside the words, "In gratitude for leadership that redefined trust." Laura greeted her warmly. Gone was the nervous teller from years before. In her place stood a confident leader, whose eyes reflected both humility and pride. "I never got to thank you properly," she said. "You changed the way I see people." Denise shook her head gently. "No, Laura, you changed yourself. I just held up the mirror." The staff applauded as she cut the ribbon. Cameras clicked, but Denise barely noticed. She wasn't there for attention. She was there to witness the proof that dignity could ripple outward, slow, steady, unstoppable. After the ceremony, she lingered in the lobby, gazing at the marble floor where her story had begun. She could almost see her younger self again, standing tall, calm, defiant. For the first time, the memory didn't sting. It healed. Later that evening, she walked along Peachtree Street, dusk settling around the city. She stopped by a small cafe and sat near the window, stirring her tea absently. The television behind the counter played a news segment about a new bill inspired by her council's ethics model. The anchor's voice mentioned her name as the architect of accountability. She smiled wryly. Architect, she murmured. All I did was refuse to move out of the blueprint. The door chimed and a familiar voice called out, I thought I might find you here. It was Renee. She hadn't changed much, still sharp, still vibrant, carrying that same unshakable loyalty. You know retirement suits you, she said, sliding into the seat across from her. You look happy. I am, Denise said. It took me half my life to learn peace doesn't come from winning. It comes from knowing you don't have to fight every battle anymore. Renee smiled. The world's still fighting for you, Denise chuckled. Let it. I gave it enough ammunition. They talked for hours, reminiscing about the old days, the audits, the speeches, the nights spent rewriting policies until dawn. When they parted, Renee hugged her tightly. You know, she whispered, when I first met you, I thought you were made of steel. Turns out you were made of grace. After she left, Denise sat for a long while watching the streetlights flicker on. The world outside had changed so much since that morning in the bank, yet its rhythms were the same. People still hurried to work, still carried dreams and debts, still tried to be seen. And in that ordinary movement, she found beauty again. Weeks later, she received an envelope without a return address. Inside was a letter written in careful handwriting. Dear Ms. Parker, my name is Janelle Whitman. You don't know me, but my father was Greg Whitman. He passed away recently. In his final days, he talked about you often, about how the moment he met you changed him. He spent the rest of his life teaching others about bias and accountability. I just wanted you to know that your grace didn't just change a bank. It redeemed a man. Thank you. Denise read the letter twice, her hands trembling slightly. She looked out the window at the morning sun and whispered, Rest easy, Greg. For the first time, she felt the full weight of closure not as victory, but as forgiveness fulfilled. That night, she opened her journal for what she knew might be the last entry. Her handwriting, though slower, was still steady. I used to think justice was about winning. It isn't. Justice is about remembering that kindness is stronger than assumption, and that silence used well can shake empires. If the world forgets everything I've said, let it remember this integrity is not a career. It's a lifetime. She closed the journal and set it beside her mother's silver pen. Over the next months, Denise's life grew even quieter. She visited classrooms, mentored young women starting businesses, and spent afternoons in her garden listening to jazz. Fame had faded into gratitude and gratitude into stillness. She didn't miss the noise. One autumn afternoon, while walking through a community fair, she noticed a group of high school students gathered around a booth labeled Ethics in Action. A banner above it read, The Parker Initiative. The students, bright-eyed and passionate, were explaining how they'd built an app to report discriminatory practices in local institutions. Denise approached, curious. A young girl noticed her and froze. Wait, you're the Denise Parker? Denise smiled. I used to be. The students surrounded her with excitement, showing her the app, the logo, the mission statement. We started this because of you, one boy said. You proved one person can change a system. She looked at them, their hope, their energy, and felt tears she didn't bother to hide. Then promise me something, she said softly. Don't try to be me. Be better, they nodded eagerly. Cameras flashed, but she didn't pose. She just stood there, surrounded by the next generation of reformers, realizing that her story no longer belonged to her. It belonged to them now, and that was exactly how it should be. That evening, as the fair lights glowed behind her, she walked home slowly, the air filled with the scent of roasted peanuts and laughter. When she reached her door, she paused and looked up at the sky, soft blue fading into gold. Somewhere out there, the world was still arguing, still striving, still stumbling toward fairness, and she was at peace knowing she had pushed it a few inches closer. Later that night, Renee called. You looked happy today, she said. I was, Denise replied. They reminded me why I started. It was never about power. It was about proof. Proof? Renee asked. That grace, Denise said quietly, can win. The next morning, the sun rose warm and clear. Denise sat by her window, writing a note she planned to leave sealed in her journal. If someone finds this someday, tell them the story started at a bank counter and ended wherever someone decided to stand their ground with dignity. She set down her pen, looked out at the city she'd once fought, and smiled. In the distance, church bells rang the same sound she'd heard on the night she'd made peace with the world. And for a long, still moment, The light caught her face just so, not as a portrait of power, but of serenity earned through every quiet battle she had ever fought. Denise Parker had walked into a bank years ago to withdraw $50,000. What she withdrew instead was something far greater: her voice, her worth, and a blueprint for every soul who had ever been told no. Now, at last, the balance was settled.